I come from a family of teachers, and I believed, looking at the people around me, that teaching is a very important job. It changes the world. I grew up bilingually, speaking Arabic and English, and I noticed that when I spoke in a certain language, my identity changed depending on that language. I noticed that my worldview also shifts in between languages. Language doesn't just describe the world. This is the easiest function that we often think about when we talk about language. Language doesn't just describe the world. Language transforms the world. Language also helps us imagine a new world. Over time, I started to realize that when a language becomes a global language like English, it's important to push back against this idea of target culture. The big question is, when a language becomes an international language, which culture comes with that language? And can you add a different culture? Can you make that language your own? Can you reconcile the different worldviews, the different languages and the different cultures when language comes with a baggage? I think it's a really complex question, that one.
Okay, so welcome to this other interview. This time our guest is Khawla Badwan from Manchester Metropolitan University, who's come to visit us. And so we're having a bit of a conversation today generally about the role of language and social justice, or perhaps social injustice as well. But let me begin with a bit of a personal question that I tend to have at the beginning. So I'm interested in knowing, how did you become an academic and why?
That's a really interesting question, Mario, and thank you so much for having me. I became interested in being an academic because since I was a little girl, I wanted to become a teacher. I come from a family of teachers, and I believed, looking at the people around me, that teaching is a very important job. It changes the world. And that was the reason why I wanted to get into teaching, and I became fascinated with language and what language can do. And how teaching can enable people to learn something new or to discover something about themselves. So I got into teaching. I did my undergraduate in English literature and linguistics, and then I moved on to do a master's in TESOL and then a PhD in education. And the more I learned about language, the more I learned about education, the more I became fascinated in becoming an academic as somebody who can do something different in the world. And this is why I decided to become an academic.
So basically your idea was, I become a teacher, teaching can enact change, can facilitate change, and that was like your main drive.
Yes.
Yeah? And then language was obviously your key interest, right? It's funny that you say you come from a family of teachers, because I come from a family of teachers as well. So that's quite a nice coincidence. So where does language then, what's the role of language in, when you say change, and then you've got this interest in language, how does language help? What's the role of language basically in enacting change?
That's a big question, the role of language in enacting change. I grew up bilingually, speaking Arabic and English. And I noticed that when I spoke in a certain language, my identity changed depending on that language. I noticed that my worldview also shifts in between languages. So from a very young age, I became interested in the idea of language, worldviews, identity, and change. And then I became an EFL tutor, and I started teaching English to students who were very passionate about discovering a new world, about traveling, about exploring things. I started with a very instrumental view of language. This is the grammar, this is vocabulary, this is how you speak, this is how you buy a ticket, this is how you order something at a restaurant. So language started for me as an instrumental thing, the functional.
What it allows you to do, like
exactly.
Yeah.
And then I think after teaching English with a functionalist mindset for a few years, I had a moment of, is that it? Is that what you do as an English? Exactly. Yeah. Is that what you do as an English teacher? You teach grammar and functions and vocabulary. And who am I in the identity construction of these people who are looking at me to teach them this language? And I think that was for me more of a moment of a professional crisis. Sort of, who am I? What do I do? What's English? What's identity? And what's the classroom? What's the language classroom more broadly? And I found lots of answers and more questions to all of these dilemmas in the field of applied linguistics. And I think this is where I became really interested in the idea of language and change. And that change operates at all sorts of levels. It could start from, your individual change. Who are you as you gaining new things and developing linguistic repertoire? Who are you as you're speaking in this accent or this language or in this space or that space? But also we're looking at change not just at an individual identity level, but we're looking at social change, at cultural change. I often say to my students, language doesn't just describe the world. This is the easiest function that we often think about when we talk about language. Language doesn't just describe the world. Language transforms the world. Language also helps us imagine a new world. So going back to your question about language and change, I think it's a fascinating question. I can't think of any change that we can ever envisage without language. And that's why language is central, absolutely central.
The power of language, yes. I mean, that's really fascinating. I mean, when you said that, so you're bilingual in Arabic and English. And then you were alluding to the fact that, Arabic gives you an identity and a worldview, and English gives you an identity and a worldview. I've got two questions about that. Is this still true? And when you were a teacher, when you were teaching English, and you say initially you were teaching English kind of functionally, did you then become aware of the fact that by teaching English to your students, these students were also being equipped with a different worldview and possibly a different identity as well? And is it something that, was it part of your reflection, your critical reflection about language teaching?
It took me years to get to that moment of reflection because it's to do with the way I was introduced into English. And unfortunately, this way in which I was introduced into English is still the dominant way, which is target language, target culture. And part of the target culture, there comes the worldview. So I grew up with this thing called English as another language with another culture and another worldview. And for a long period of my life, I used to think that these two things are not reconcilable. That, when you're speaking two languages, you're dealing with two cultures and two worldviews. Over time, I started to realize that when a language becomes a global language like English, it's important to push back against this idea of target culture. The big question is, when a language becomes an international language, which culture comes with that language? And can you add a different culture? Can you make that language your own? Can you reconcile the different worldviews, the different languages, and the different cultures? When language comes with a baggage? I think it's a really complex question, that one. And I think the way English language education is done is mainly to blame for that separation between languages and worldviews. Going back to your question, can it be done differently? Yes, it can be done differently. And I think it's really important that we raise awareness about what comes with language, what comes with acquiring a new tongue and a new identity in a new language, but also how do you reconcile all these different worldviews when you are shifting between different language spaces and different linguistic and cultural scapes? Yeah.
I mean, that's, again, very, very intriguing because, as you know, my sort of main interest academically is English in the world Englishes, and English is a global language and so on. So one of the things that we keep saying, including to our students, right, that English has diversified and exists, and it has existed for centuries now in different parts of the world, different cultures, etc. And so it has absorbed different cultures, and therefore is able to carry so the famous Chinua Achebe quote that says, English will be able to carry my African experience. And so the question, I think, still remains, right? To what extent can you speak language X, let's say English, because of its sort of global spread, and genuinely express a culture that somehow, like in EFL, we talk about target culture, right? Or language teaching in general. I would argue that with English, the target culture becomes less meaningful, possibly. And this is, at least from a world English perspective, it basically says English is now exists in so many different varieties. But my big question is, to what extent do we believe that this is actually true? So to what extent do we believe that somebody in different parts of the world speaking English truly expresses their set of cultural values and is completely divorced from whatever cultural baggage, to use your word, may come with the English language? So can we completely separate the two and assume that the English language, like any other language, is completely able to absorb and become the vehicle of completely different cultures?
I think that's a really difficult question, and it's to do with what we mean by culture and what kind of spaces are we talking about. So if we're thinking about institutional cultures, for example, this is quite different from national cultures.
Yeah.
In institutional cultures, the affordances are quite limited because you're dictated by an institutionalized way of doing something.
Yeah.
And this is really interesting. So academia is a really good example. Academics using English across the world are using it within institutionalized parameters, within the boundaries of the publication industry, within certain perceptions around editing and language representation and accuracy and all of that. Yeah. Can you truly reflect who you are in the middle of all of these constraints? Maybe no. Are we blaming national culture? Not necessarily. We're blaming a sector, an industry, a very, very rigid institutionalized way of doing things. So that there are constraints. Now, outside academia, can you use English to perform other means of cultural resistance? There are all sorts of examples from artists, from scholars and philosophers who were successful at expressing their dilemmas, their struggles through the medium of English. There'll always be things that are beyond translation. There'll be things that are rooted in a particular cultural belief or in a particular philosophy that gets diluted the minute you translate it into English. But I think also that there are very clever ways that you can use to try and reflect what these things can be. So it's a really difficult question to answer, but I think to get to it, we need to ask ourselves, what do we mean by culture when we're trying to say, can we bridge cultures? Can we treat English as a sponge that actually absorbs all these cultures? The answer is, it depends.
It depends. Yeah, it depends. It's you're right. It's extremely complex. And also the fact you were talking about artists and writers, etc. In a way, they are in a privileged position, right? But then, when you look at people who are not artists or not writers, and therefore the majority of people, would then operate within this language, the question becomes a different question. Right?
Absolutely.
It's also, the other thing that kind of fascinates me as well is, like, to what extent are we talking about the language being able to absorb and the sponge and so on, or actually people? You know what I mean? Like, perhaps sometimes we give too much agency to language itself. It's actually people that do things and act and use language their own way and express whatever they express through linguistic material. And I think what fascinates me as well, this idea that people often mix languages as well. So you could be talking in English and Arabic together. Somebody could be using Hindi and English and other languages together. And that, to me, is a really powerful way of gaining this idea of ownership, owning language material to do things differently. So yes, it's a huge, big question, isn't it? The other thing I wanted to explore with you a little bit is this idea of social justice or social injustice. And again, what's the language's role in that? How do we What are some of the examples in which language is actively part of social justice or social injustice in your experience?
Wow.
Yeah.
Where do we start
I
with
know,
that?
where do you start? Big questions I'm asking.
These are really big questions. With big questions, my approach is to try and go back to basics. And one way of going back to basics is to ask the question, what is language?
Yeah.
Who gets to define what language is? Who gets to say what a standard language is, what a proper language is, what an international language is, what an academic language is? And I think that takes us to the politics of naming and the hierarchy that comes within language. Yeah. In my work, I talk about language as a verb, not as a noun.
Okay.
So when you're thinking about language as a verb, you're thinking about how you live with language, how you embody who you are with language, how language becomes part of your being and part of your becoming. And when you're thinking about language as being and becoming rather than the instrumentalized definition of a means of communication, suddenly language takes a life of its own.
Okay.
And if you center that new life, the becoming and being, that's when you start to see that language and social justice come hand in hand. Okay. Respect for language is respect for identities, respect for social justice and recognition. So number one, to answer your question, we need to rethink what we mean by this thing we call language. Okay. If we start thinking of language as a verb, language not only means, but also matters. So in my work, I talk a lot about language mattering and the importance of exploring language mattering, how language matters in our lives, in our societies, how language matters to the different societal challenges that we're trying to fight. And through mattering, through language as a verb, you rethink what language is and you place it in the center when you're discussing what social justice is. Okay. Now, social justice is another big thing. We can go back to Plato's time. Yes. What is justice? Yeah. And the idea of a utopian world. How can we be just? Why do we need to be just? All of these questions have been with humans for a very long time. And it fascinates me that we're still grappling with the idea of what's justice, what's social justice. Yeah. Now, the common interpretations of language and social justice is we need to think about recognition. So we're recognizing different languages, different varieties. We're also playing on the politics of redistribution, and we're also thinking about representation. These are important. So all of these dimensions of social justice are the ones that are often called upon whenever we think about language and social justice. And I also advocate them in my work. But I also like to go beyond them because this idea of distribution, redistribution, this idea of representation and recognition is important, but we need to add an ethical dimension to that, because the limitations with the commonly cited ways of talking about social justice is suddenly social justice becomes a neoliberal buzzword that to achieve social justice you need to do X and Y and Z. You need to represent, you need to redistribute, you need to recognize. Nice, but there is more to social justice. And I would like to center ethics in the middle of all that discussion around social justice. Ethics is about relationality. It's about how do we exist for each other? How do we exist for each other, with each other, and sometimes in spite of each other? And thinking more broadly about the role of language and culture in relation to our existence for one another. And that, once you start to think about it, that's when you start to make social justice a really, really complex construct that goes beyond easy fixes. Yeah. And I think easy fixes are really problematic because you can easily come up with a list of these are the things that you need to consider to think about social justice. It's much more than that.
Let me check if I've understood. So I think what you're saying is that, what I've understood is that we can think of social justice as a set of processes where things like distribution and redistribution are, let's say, made more equal and more just, right? And things like that, and representation. But perhaps the inherent problem in that is that you're still thinking, or implicitly, there is someone who fixes and someone who gets fixed.
Exactly.
And so what you're saying is, from an ethical point of view, what we also need to do is redefine the relationship among us.
Yes.
And that is fundamental in really attaining a fuller and richer and more real, meaningful idea of justice. Is that right?
Absolutely.
So, otherwise we're stuck in that relationship whereby fundamentally it's an imbalance of power.
Yes.
So those with power decide what is injustice and what is unjust and how to fix it.
Absolutely.
And come up with this, we need to do this, do this, do this. But,
and equally, they come up with decisions on what to distribute and what not to distribute, what to represent and what to hide, what to recognize and what to misrecognize. And suddenly social justice becomes a solution to a colonial problem that is also done in a colonial way.
In a colonial way. So the solution itself is still part
colonial.
of coloniality. Yeah, okay. That's really powerful. Yes. It's a really interesting way of rethinking what social justice actually is and what it involves. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think it's a daunting task, Mario, the more you think about the problematic theorizations of social justice. But I often go back to the idea of, yes, we need to centralize ethics, but we also need to rethink what language is. Because without rethinking what language is and what language does, we will become stuck with this idea of a neoliberal, instrumentalized way of this is language as a resource, what do you do with it? And I think part of our job as applied linguists is to challenge the language as a resource. Language is a resource, but it's certainly much more than that.
There's much more than that. So there's quite a lot, right, in that, because even this idea of language as a verb is something that, for most people is quite new, right? Been talked about in literature, you talk about it, etc. But it is still a concept that it's not so obvious. So language is doing rather than language is a noun, right? And so some people talk about languaging and so on. So it's really reconceptualizing something that we have thought about in certain ways for a very long time, and then we are now saying, well, language is a verb. What does that mean? So. And the other big question is, so what do we do, or what can we do, or should we do in education to address these things? Now, I'm going to start, for example, I'm going to start a new module on language and social justice. So how do we even teach that, all of these things that we're talking about, in a way that transcends coloniality? Because in a way, you are the teacher, and therefore you're in a position of power. And so it's difficult to completely maybe avoid certain types of relationships. But generally, though, so in education, how do we address some of these things in a way that actually is meaningful to our students? And say, okay, they see what we're talking about.
I think our students actually get it.
Okay.
So from my experience of teaching about language and social justice, I've never been in a position where students go, oh, that's too abstract, too philosophical. I have no idea what you're talking about.
That's reassuring.
It is. And I mean, in my work, I talk a lot about the idea of a professional vulnerability. That's when you are professionally vulnerable because you exist within a colonial structure, within a colonial institutionalized sector, and you are rethinking, unthinking lots of things, and there are lots of uneasy rehearsals, and there are lots of improvisations, and lots of, did I get it right? And I talk to my students about that. I talk to them about the importance of embracing professional vulnerability, because when you are professionally vulnerable, yes, there will be moments when we are collectively vulnerable. And I've had numerous instances when we as a group in a classroom felt collectively vulnerable as we are grappling with the coloniality of language. Now, when we go back to language as a verb, all of us as individuals using language in all the different ways in which language can be conceptualized, we understand how we use language as a verb. We understand the doing, the becoming, the proactive, the reactive, the nature of always being and the making, because as language users, that's what we do. And we grow up with language, we grow up acquiring new language, we grow up moving between spaces, we grow up realizing that in certain spaces you need to speak in this way, in other spaces you need to speak in that way. So as individuals, most people get it. The idea of language as a verb is something that is not alien to the human experience. Now, the conversation around social justice, I find it a really important conversation. And I think the more I talk about and I teach about social justice, the more I invite people to take it to new contexts and new domains and think about what's going on. And it fascinates me, Mario, all these discussions that I have with students, bringing all these examples from different contexts, different countries, different disciplines, different sectors. I've experienced this, I've noticed this, I've read about that. And in a way, the classroom becomes a space that opens up all of these provocations around what social justice is, what social justice can be. And I like to think, as much as discomforting all of that could be, it's a generative, hopeful space that embraces discomfort to actually encourages you and pushes you to do something.
Discomfort, I like that. I like the idea that, the classroom becomes a space where discomfort has a place, but then discomfort turns into, I don't know, action in a way. And changes your mind. And that kind of goes back to your initial kind of drive to become a teacher, right? I want to become a teacher because I want to implement change. And that's exactly what happens. I think especially in a class where you're dealing with language and social justice, and the idea of unsettling. This is something I talk to my students about a lot. The positive experience of feeling unsettled, right, and feeling out of your comfort zone, to use a cliche, because that in itself is extremely productive and intellectually stimulating. It's really the only way that you can change your views and develop ideas, right?
Absolutely.
Because otherwise, if you keep talking, that's why I like that. Because even from our point of view, sometimes I struggle thinking, I need to represent the best possible model, right? I need to be the purest and the best possible intellectual embodiment of, and it's not like that at all, right?
There isn't a best model.
There isn't. Yeah. So you're in the classroom, formally in a position of power, but at the same time, in a position where you have to be humble enough to put yourself in a position where you're also learning.
Absolutely.
And you're totally fallible and you are uncertain as well. Yeah, and you develop ideas together with the students, and this is something that when the students get this, it's a really good achievement, I think.
Absolutely, and you're also becoming a role model for how to navigate the ambiguities and uncertainties of our times. So I often talk to my students who, like your students, will graduate and become English teachers.
Yeah.
I always talk to them about the power of becoming an English teacher. I always remind them that you have agency, you have power, and you will be able to make change, even if you think of it as a localized change. You are important. And I always say to my students, you are important, and the feeling in the room changes. Yes, we might feel collectively vulnerable. We might feel overwhelmed by the ethical ambiguities of our times, but we also need to create a space of solidarity and allyship and empowering one another, because together we can do something. And going back to the point that I started with, if you are in teaching, it's one of the most influential and impactful jobs that you could ever have.
Yeah.
Now, I talk about vulnerability a lot. And I theorize it, and I go to, feminist theorizations of vulnerability. Judith Butler talks about the idea of vulnerability and agency. When people take back to the streets and they want to protest against a president, do they suddenly become vulnerable? Or are they agentive? Is vulnerability the opposite of agency? Or can vulnerability and agency bleed into each other? And I think in English language education, we find ourselves in a very similar position. We're navigating the coloniality of language, but we're also trying to do something about it. Yeah. There is the vulnerability and there is the agency. And going to your point, I think by navigating the vulnerability and agency and creating a space in the classroom for trying all of that, you're modeling a sustainable way of navigating all of this. Yeah. And often my students talk a lot about employability and how, again, employability is one of these instrumentalized ways that we often use in the sector. Employability means you learn certain skills and you certain knowledge. Fine. The skill that we often don't talk about is the skill of navigating the vulnerabilities and the ambiguities of our time. Yeah. And I think by teaching about language and social justice, we're actually creating that space. And we are empowering our students by raising awareness. Yes, we might not have easy fixes and answers, and that's your recipe and that's how you deal with it. It's not employability in your traditional checklist employability way, but it's awareness raising and it's developing capabilities and abilities to become more than an English teacher. You suddenly become a language educator. And that situates you in a completely different space.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. That's so inspiring. Really, it really is. And the other thing is that, caught my attention is how important the togetherness is in the classroom. Because like talking about employability, there's this kind of excessive, in my opinion, emphasis on the individual. So this education will equip you with skills, etc., that will give you or will facilitate a career in whatever domains. And this kind of, and also the way that we evaluate, it's kind of very individual, right? So sometimes students see themselves as like, I am almost in competition with my classmates, whereas this turns the whole thing in its head and looks at the classroom as a space, a collective space, isn't it? Where ideas are developed, challenged, and so on. Khawla, thank you very, very much for this really, really good conversation. And I've learned a lot. I mean, it's been very, very inspiring. And I'm sure it will be for our viewers, for the students, and so on. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.